Welcome to this tutorial. I am Peter Thompson. This tutorial is for students of the module TT284 who are approaching the second assignment and looking for further help with the practical work. Web technologies is not an easy subject. A typical web application requires knowledge of the markup language HTML, knowledge of how styles are applied using CSS style sheets, knowledge of the programming language JavaScript to run on the browser, and knowledge of a programming language to run on the server, such as PHP. You need to tackle the TMA at the level that you understand. Don't try and answer the TMA by modifying the code to part 6 if you don't fully understand it. Base your answer to the practical work from code earlier in the module which you do understand, or on the code from this tutorial, which is available in your practical activities forum. Most web-based applications use a common set of technologies. The user interface is displayed in a web browser. The information for this is collected from a remote web server that is identified by its URL. The user interface is created using HTML5. User input uses HTML forms and buttons. The appearance of this interface is controlled by the CSS styles from a separate style sheet collected from a URL on the same remote server. Basic validation of user input uses validation that is built into HTML5. JavaScript may be used to create more complex interaction on the client, but we are not using it in these tutorial examples. For this tutorial, we will look at a simple version of a website for a sports club that allows a new member to enter their details, to check their details, and then edit their details. The first task is to decide what data needs to be captured from the user and what we will call this information and what type of data we will store in the database. We will need a member's name, and we can label that as a single word member name and allow text of up to 200 characters. We're not going to separate first name and surname, as this doesn't apply to everyone who might use to the database. The email address, we will label it email and allow text up to 200 characters. The member's contact telephone, we will call telephone and allow up to 12 characters of text. We will also have a paragraph where the members can introduce themselves. We will label it intro and allow up to 2,000 characters of text. The member's date of birth, which we will use a single label, date of birth, which will be a date type, and a password, member password, and we will allow up to 200 characters for a memorable phrase. Before you start work on the server, upload the updated set of utility files. They allow you to check the PHP files for some errors. You can also use the utility files to inspect the code of files on the server, and they greatly increase the ease of updating your files on the server. I've already uploaded the utilities files into my block 2 folder, and now I'm going to run the script to upload and display code, and I'm going to upload the files for this tutorial. I can do so by dragging and dropping each one in turn. As you can see, this greatly speeds up the process, and if you're editing a file, changing it and repeating this process, it's much faster. Right, those are the files that we need. I can refresh this view. The files I've uploaded are now listed. I can look at them on the server as well as running them by clicking on the right hand link. So if I want to see the file to display all data, at the moment it doesn't run because there is no table for it to display. It's showing an error, and below I can see the code itself. What I need to do is to start by creating a table that has actually run within this window, and we've created the table for the sports club. If I run this again, we can now see that we've got the new table, club members, for the club. Our next task is to create the HTML page that will be used by new members to enter their data. We'll call this newmembers.html, and we also need to identify the script on the server that will be used to save the data from this form, and we're going to call it save-member-data.php. We need this at this point because we need to enter this as the action of the form that we're going to use. In my program editor, I've got this file, and I'll run through it explaining the different components. It is a static HTML file, and we've identified it as being HTML5 using the character set UTF-8. I've got a title and a link to the style sheet which will apply styles to this page. A header that contains the title of the page, Club New Member Application Form, and then the form that users will fill in if they want to join the club. The method is post, and the action is the script save-member.data.php. Each of the items that they will enter are grouped within a field set, and it produces a legend at the top which will be your details. Grouping similar items together helps the user fill in the details. Each of the items that need to be filled in, we have a label which helps with making it accessible. If you click on your full name, focus will be given to the input. And the first is the member name. Its type is text. We've given it a name of member name, also an ID of member name. Placeholder, your full name. The required to ensure that it gets filled in, so this is using the HTML5 validation. A maximum length of 200 characters, minimum length of 2, and no value that is set. So if we switch to the view of this page, here's the newmembers.html file in the server. We can click on that, and this is now being displayed. It's also being styled with our style sheet, which we'll come to later. Here you can see how a group of input elements has been grouped together. This is one group, this is a second group, and to keep everything level here, I've also put this single item in a group, and then everything follows the same pattern within the code. So here's the code for the first input element. Field set legend and input element. Field set the legend input element and the input box with the placeholder. And that should be a placeholder, but it's because I've used this similar form before, Firefox has remembered what I put in as a test, so we're not seeing that. So ignore the text that's there. There should be a placeholder there. In here we have telephone as a placeholder, email as a placeholder, and introduce yourself as the date of birth. We're using the HTML element for date, and if we click on that, we should see a date selector. Now, because we are not allowing dates that are more recent for someone who's very young, we see a blank view, but if we go back, then we should be able to select someone and be able to select dates that are earlier than this. So 22nd of 11th 2010. If I now click back on it, we'll see a proper date picker. The date pickers are not working properly in all browsers using HTML. Chrome is quite good. Firefox isn't quite as good at the moment. Passphrase appears as a row of dots. Telephone numbers, we can type in the digits. If we try and submit, then the HTML5 will kick in with its validation. So you want an email. The email needs to be a pattern such as this with a test@test.com. Telephone needs to be a series of numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The introduce yourself can be any amount of text, and submit. Next, let us look at the style sheet that we use to create the appearance of our form. We've kept it as simple as possible. All inputs will be styled with a background color set here and a width of 75% of the parent div. All labels are set with a text color blue, a width, they float to the left, and they clear both, so they follow underneath each other. The input type submit is then modified to display as a block. The corners have a border radius. We've given it a height and a background color that is different from the other input elements. Margins are auto, which should center it in the middle. We need to use display block in order to be able to set margins in this way. Otherwise, the input elements are in line. The field set has margins that are auto, so this will appear in the middle of the browser window, and we've set a maximum width so that if the browser view is wider than this, the field set won't extend to be wider. We need to create the database table that we're going to use for this tutorial, and we do that using a script, create a members table. You will need to add your own database details, which are on your welcome page from the server. So you will have a database, a username, and a password. Remember to use single quotes around the password. It won't work with double quotes. The host name remains as localhost. The script needs to connect to the database, and it should warn you with a message if it's unable to connect, and it would then halt at this point. If it has connected, it's going to give you this message, good, this is connected to MySQL. We then need to select the database which is using the variables that we created earlier. My database being database details you've put in here. And again, if it cannot connect, you'll get a warning message and the program will end. If it's worked, it'll tell you it's connected to the database. This script is then going to see what tables are already in the database. This will vary depending on what you've already done. We're using a query to show tables from our database, and we're going to collect the results and to print them out. So you will get a list of the table names. Once you've run this program more than once, it will show you the table that we're going to create next. So we're going to create a table, if it doesn't already exist, called Club Members. We're starting with an ID, although we don't in fact use this in this particular tutorial, and that would be an integer that's 6 digits long. Increment primary, auto increment primary key means that every time you save a new record to this database, it will increment the ID. So every row will get a unique ID. We've got the member name, variable characters 200, not null. It means it mustn't be empty. Notice the comma after each of these. If you add another row, make sure you add another comma at the end. Email, variable characters 200. Telephone, variable characters 14. Intro is just text, we don't need to set a size. Date of birth is a date. The member password, again, variable character 200 and not null. We don't need a comma as this is the last item in our list. And we then end the SQL statement. We use this for an MySQLi query. If this query works, we get that message. If it doesn't work, we get an error creating table, club members, and it'll give us a message that can be used if we need to do any debugging. And if you are asking on the forums what has happened, always give the messages that you're getting so that we know exactly what's happening. And then we close our handle to the database. So that should have created the database ready for the next action to take place. We've now created our database table. Data from the HTML forms and buttons is sent back to the remote web server, again identified by its URL, and usually this will use the post action from a form. We want to place each set of data in a single row in the database. We've already called the database club members, and we will need to create a script to add the data to the table in our database. This is a separate document again. We've started by creating our array for web data, and we check if the global post variable is empty or not. If there is content in this post array, we're going to transfer it to our web data array. If there is no data, we will simply give a message to say that there's no data to process and exit the script. We have identified the table as being club members. Again, I have set the values of my database username and password from the welcome page on the server. We connect to the database, and we connect to SQL first, then to the database, and we're going to use an insert into my table command, and we're going to insert the member name, the email, telephone, intro, date of birth, member password, using the values, and we have a question mark for each value. This is a much more secure method of inserting data into a database. We prepare this statement, and if we can't prepare it, we die with a message and an error. Then we bind the values to the statement. Now, for each of the values in the statement, we set the type of string or integer, but in our case we're just going to use strings. So there's an S here for every value in this list. So the number of values is the same as the number of question marks, is the same as the number of S's in the string, and then we give the value for each question mark in the same order as we've stated them in the SQL statement. So we've got our member name, email. These are all the values submitted by the form, placed in our web data array, and now being used to bind to the parameters in the SQL statement. So they've got to match up in number and in order. Once we've done that, we can execute this statement. If it doesn't work, then we produce an error message, but if it does, everything has now been inserted into one row in our database table. And then we must close the database handle at the end. So that is a set of data submitted from the form and now entered into the database. In order to check that the data is present in the database, we can use another script, display all data.php. So this again is using the same table as before, club members table. We're connecting to MySQL using our variables that we've set up. We're connecting to my database, and then we're using the SQL statement select star from my table. We execute this query and store the values in results, and then while row is, and we're fetching associative here from the result. Associative means that we can use the table names to, the column names to identify the component, the item that we're looking at each time. So while row is placing these in an array, and we can identify the array by the column name. So row member name will echo, print out the member's name that we've entered into the table. And the same applies for each of the other elements that are within this database table row, with a space between each of the elements. So it's just going to print out a paragraph that shows us what's been stored in the database. Let us now check how that works using our application form. So we will insert into full name, testing my name. We've got a date of birth, we've got a telephone number, we've got an email, and I can introduce myself with this is a test. So I can now submit. I don't want to save that. And I need to sign back in again. And it's telling me no data to process. I wonder if that was because I had to sign in. Let's go back. And here we have the data has been saved in the database. Right, let's look and see what data was stored. We will use display all data, but we'll use this link just to run it. And there we get just the data on that row. Testing my name, email, test@test.com, telephone number. This is a test, which was the introduction, date of birth, and in this case, password. Now remember that in a real site, you would always store a password using an encrypted hash and salt. You'd never store it in plain text like this. If you get something wrong in your table, you can drop the table, that is, delete the table and all its data, and then create the table again. You need to edit the code in drop-the-table.php to point to the table you want to drop. The code for this is relatively simple. Again, we're using My Table Club members. If you want to drop a different table, then insert the name of the different table here. You need to have your details for connecting to the database with your username and password from the welcome page on the server. Again, the process is connect to MySQL, connect to the database. The SQL is drop the table and the name of the table from the variable here, so this would be club members. And then we execute the query. And if the query is true, the table has been deleted. If not, there's an error somewhere and we print out the error. The next stage in the process is a little bit more complicated, and we want now to edit our own row of data. When a set of data is edited, the row has first to be selected and identified as a row in the database. The information in this row is then sent as the content of a web form to the user who has permission to edit the data. In this example, we're going to use the email address and the passphrase to identify the row to be edited. The edited data can then be posted back to the server, and there must be some way of ensuring that the user is allowed to edit the data. Again, we will use the old email address and the old passphrase to identify the row to be updated. Those values are in the row in the server until the update process is completed. But note again, passwords should never be stored in plain text on the server. They should always be stored after encryption with a hash plus a salt. If we look at the code that we need for this, if we look at the file edit mydata.php. Again, we're collecting the material from the web form, checking to see if the post array is empty or not. If it is empty, we're going to provide a form for the user to log in, and this form will contain the email and a space for the member password. And this is simply the same part of the form that we used earlier, but now inserted into our PHP document. Again, we need to identify the table that we're using, club members, and again fill in the details that we're going to use to access the database. We connect to MySQL, we connect to our database, and we're now checking to see if we've got the value for old email, which is what we have called the existing email data in the form that we'll show in a moment. If the user has logged in correctly, we're going to select all items in the row from my table where the email and the member's password are what the user has used to sign in to this particular script. Again, we prepare the statement, or die if we cannot do that with an error message. We've only got two parameters this time, where email is equal to question mark, where member's password is equal to question mark, so two parameters. So two strings, two SS here, and the parameters are going to be the email and the member's password. So two question marks, two S's for two strings, two values to be bound into our query. We prepare the statement and we get the data from the database. I'm still using while row, but we could use fetch one. We're only expecting one row for a given email address and password here. The values from the database are now going to be inserted as values into each of the form elements. So this is the same form that we used before as a static page, but this time we are inserting the value from the database into its corresponding value in the form. So here we've got the member name. We're using HTML special characters to ensure that no malicious content can be returned to the user. The date of birth inserted in the date of birth element, and so on. Telephone inserted, email inserted, and the introduction inserted. What we don't insert is the value for the password. The user has to insert that again. But to the original form, we've added another field set, which is for the old email address, the email that is currently in use, and the old member password, the phrase that is currently in use as a password to log in. We need this to be sure that the user is entitled to edit this particular item, and also when we save this item we need to know the value of the old email and the old member password, and we use that in our query when we save the data, so that if we've got the old email value, we know it's an edited form that is being submitted. We're going to update the contents of the table. We're setting the member name, the email, the telephone, the introduction, the date of birth, the member password, where the email is equal to a value and member password is equal to a value. These are still the old values, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 question marks in the SQL statement. So we need 8 S's in our bind parameter statement and 8 values. So we've got the member name, email, telephone, intro, date of birth, member password, which is the new member password, and then we've got the old email and the old member password, which match up to the where email equals question and member password equals question. We then execute our prepared statement, and if everything matches, then we have updated the database row and we close the database handle. So that will have completed an editing process. Next, we want to view that. So again, if we go to our page, we want the page to edit my data, and I've got to remember what name I put in, what email I put in, and my password. The email was test@test.com. The passphrase, the cat sat on the map, which this browser has remembered, and I don't think that was our password and phrase. Let us just check. Let's just look to see what we had in the database. That should be test@test.com for the email, and the cat sat on the map. Ah, yes, I'd forgotten that. The cat sat on the map, not the mat. Right. Let's go back again and try it again. Edit my data. Test@test.com. And I think the browser has saved it wrongly. It saved a previous version. So we want the cat sat on the map and submit. There we go. So we've got to make sure that we have a passphrase again by entering something here. This is a test, and I will update this. And in order to do the update, I've got to use the current email and the current password. And when I submit that, that edit to the introduction should be included. But on this form, I could edit anything, including the a new passphrase. But it's not particularly user-friendly because users would forget to enter a new passphrase. They'd leave it empty, and then it would be unprotected. That would need to be validated to ensure that something had been entered. Your members' data has been saved in our database. So we've now gone through the process of entering data and editing data and being able to check to see what data there is. Now this is a simple sequence of actions, and you can use a simple sequence like this within the TMA if you're not sure about using a more complicated sequence. You can add other actions to this basic set of scripts. You can modify them, or if you do understand them fully, go for the scripts in block 6. But don't struggle, in part 6, but don't struggle with part 6 scripts if you don't understand them. Base your TMA on the simple scripts that you do understand. Develop it as a series of files. Don't try and do everything at once. Keep backup copies, and then submit your best effort for the TMA. It doesn't have to be 100% working in order to get a good proportion of the marks, and the practical work is only 50% of the overall marks of the assignment. So don't be put off by not understanding everything. This module is designed to cater for both the complete beginner and those who have already got some experience of developing web apps and using HTML, JavaScript and so on. So do answer at the level that suits you. The library has a number of reference sources. Mozilla Developer Network web docs is very useful. You can go straight to them. The other books are all available as ebooks from the library. They are all at different levels, so pick books that are appropriate to your own skills. Some of them are references for advanced programmers. Others are starter guides for complete beginners. Being able to look up material and use references like this is an essential part of programming, because you will never ever learn everything that you need. You always need to have resources at your fingertips just to check the individual items. I work in 4 or 5 different languages, and every development session I will check something because I don't hold it all in my head. And as beginners or improvers, you also need to learn how to check your sources of information. Now, I hope that's been useful. I hope it will set you en route to completing the assignment. It doesn't matter what level you tackle the TMA at, whether you're a complete beginner, whether you're an advanced programmer, tackle it at the level that suits you and you will pass this assignment. As long as you are learning, that is what matters. So thank you for paying attention to the tutorial, and we hope that it's been of use for you.